Is an alliance between Israel and America so crazy that there's no other explanation besides this powerful lobby which actively bends American foreign policy to Israel's will? That is the claim of the book The Israel Lobby, and that is the position that has been propagated among many corners of American discourse, and it has slowly seeped its way into the mainstream. The amount of damage that that book has done to Israel's standing in the public discourse can never be fully known, but it also shouldn't be underestimated. Essentially, you have two academics of high stature presenting as objective fact the idea that Israel and its lobby effectively bend the strongest superpower in the world to its will. Conspiracy theorists from the left and right, the pro-Palestinian camp, and those classic anti-Semites had a field day having their fever dreams confirmed and adopted by these respectable academics. On the pro-Israel side, people were quick to jump to the defense. However, a lot of these defenses fell into the trap of arguing facts. Whether there was a lobby, how powerful is the lobby? What did it do here? What did it do there? Or simply making normative claims about shared values. But because of the logic around their discourse on the lobby is structured, these arguments were often apparently swept aside simply by an endless barrage of whataboutism and bogged down in a million cherry-picked examples, which you would have to mount a full-throated defense for every single one. And that defense would remain unconvincing to anyone who didn't want to be convinced. This is true of the book and the modern online and offline discourse, which has recycled those same logical arguments. Acquiescing to these arguments makes you fall into the trap of accepting that the burden of proof is on the pro-Israel side, that it has to prove the lobby isn't all-powerful, when in reality, the burden of proof rests squarely on the other side. This is because the entire concept of the Israel lobby is built on the assumption that supporting Israel is not only the wrong choice, but a choice so objectively wrong as to be illegitimate and not up for legitimate debate. Therefore, the only possible reason why the U.S. would support Israel is this existence of a super powerful lobby. That is the burden of proof that Walt and Mearsheimer place on themselves. They need to prove that it is illegitimate to support Israel, not that the pro-Israel side has to prove that every single action of the lobby was correct. Walt and Mearsheimer spend the first half of their book trying to prove this, and I'm going to be grading that work. I'm going to show you how they fail over and over again, and how the entire work is full of circular logic, unfalsifiable claims, and blatant contradictions. I really hold that the best book to disprove the Israel Lobby is the book The Israel Lobby itself, provided you read it with a small modicum of academic literacy. And by looking at how they made those arguments, we can better understand how to approach the same tired logic which still appears today. This is Causality, the news of symptoms. We provide the diagnosis. My name is Sharon Bar Eretz. I am a major in the IDF reserves. I also have a background in international relations, political science, and sociology. And on this channel, we take a look behind the scenes to see the reasons why world events happen the way they do. As I have said before, I am biased. Everyone is biased. The problem with Walt and Mearsheimer is that they present themselves and their book as if it is completely objective. Because of their stature, people take their findings as objective findings. In this video, I'm going to tear that apart. And I'll be doing that knowing that you, my viewer, knows my bias. Because as long as you look at my arguments and judge them on their merits, I believe that anyone who even opens a small opening to hear the other side my side will understand these arguments because, in actuality, proving that this book is wrong is not that hard to do. This is going to be a fun one. Most of the arguments here I came to independently, but as expected, it was easy to see that all of these have been made by one academic or another over the years. What I've tried to do here is something that I actually haven't seen elsewhere, to lay them out one after another. In my last video, believe it or not, I played nice. In this video, I leave no quarter. In that previous video, I went through the theoretical framework behind the book, Neorealism. I explained how they, the authors, look at international relations through a strict, materially interest-based lens. And the authors, being one of the main proponents of this view, they saw the U.S. support of Israel, and they felt that it didn't make sense according to their theory. And to explain this, they invented an externality, the Israel Lobby, in order to explain a world that didn't fit their theory. Instead of understanding that perhaps their theory isn't correct. In that video, I showed this visualization. To them, the US had two options. Option A is an alliance or an alignment with all Middle Eastern states. Option B would be support or an alliance with Israel. And we can assign arbitrary values. Let's say plus 1,000 for the Middle Eastern states and minus 1,000 for that small strip of arid land, Israel. The numbers don't really matter as much as the idea. They argue that the rational choice is obviously option A, but irrationally, the US chose option B. Instead of saying perhaps their theory is wrong or incomplete, they invent this lobby to account for the discrepancy. And because there is such a large gap between the two options, they need to assign it this arbitrary number, let's say 2,500, of the power of the lobby that would bend support towards Israel. This means that the supposed proof of the power of the Israel lobby is derived not from inductive reasoning, which showed actual influence, but from deductive reasoning. For them to explain irrational behavior, you need an externality proportional to irrationality of the decision. Because they viewed the decision as completely irrational, that externality has to be proportionally large. In the previous video, I discussed why the assumption that states are operating under this strict material interest is wrong. But here, I'm going to accept that premise for a moment. I will accept that a state could only act according to what is rational and in narrow material interests. For this video, I am going to be a neorealist. But as a neorealist, I'm going to destroy their own internal logic using the same information that they provide, aided by a few counterfactual. In doing so, I'm going to hopefully lay the groundwork to dismantle the same types of logical fallacies which still occur in the everyday discourse. My previous video actually received a bit of traction among many in the crowd who would blame Israel for all of the problems of the world and the US. And the comments on that video reflect that, which has actually solved for me a bit of a dilemma. Because instead of having to trust that you, the viewer, is aware of some of the more darker areas of the internet, I merely need to suggest that you pop on over to the comment section of my last video. There you will find a good representation of many of the types of claims which are floating out there in the ether against Israel. These type of arguments can be very eye-opening to those previously unaware of their existence. And this video will serve as a rebuttal to many of those comments without looking at each one in particular, and understand how those arguments there are really simply reproducing the bad arguments of the book. So thank you so much for all those who commented so nicely on that video, which provided me that wealth of examples for this one. Now, what this video isn't is a full explanation of the merits of a U.S.-Israeli alliance. To disprove the lobby, as I mentioned, about their high standard, I don't need to do that. And to do that will take more time. And hopefully over future videos, I can slowly build to something that approaches it. Here, all that is needed is to show how that alliance is a legitimate position that can be reasonably held by Americans seeking to advance American interests. On to the book itself. The book is separated into two parts. The first is where they try to prove that supporting Israel is a completely illegitimate choice. And in the second part, they show how strong the lobby really is. But they show that in a way where, because any support of Israel is illegitimate, any support of Israel must be the result of the lobby. Therefore, any support of Israel is proof of the lobby, rather than any support of Israel being proof of support of Israel. It's this tautology which doesn't prove anything. And for that reason, I'm not going to be touching so much upon it, even though there are problems. But because so much of the regular defenses of the Israel lobby are looking at that part of the book, and that's kind of the trap that they set, I'm going to be putting that mostly on the side. I'm going to be looking at the first part of the book, because if the first part of the book isn't true, then the second part of the book doesn't follow. If supporting Israel is legitimate and it is a valid position to be held, then the second part of the book simply proves that there is support for Israel with some lobbying involved. Okay? And so the first part of the book is them really trying as hard as they can to make every possible argument why supporting Israel is completely illegitimate. It's actually quite amazing the lengths they go. And they rest that idea on three pillars. The first is that the alliance with Israel is unconditional in nature, and that no other alliance is unconditional. The second is that the support for Israel is unprecedented, both in terms of how much aid is provided and the lobby itself is unprecedented. And the third is that supporting Israel is not in the U.S. interest. Therefore, if 1 is true, and 2 is true, and 3 is true, it must be an outside force forcing the U.S. to support Israel. To disprove the book, you only need to dismantle 1 of these pillars. I am going to dismantle all 3. First up is the pillar that U.S. support for Israel is weirdly unconditional. Is it really? That is a fascinating claim. In fact, their own book is filled with examples and quotes of times when the U.S. went against Israel's interest. And this is really one of their main fallacies, dare I say, their main academic misconduct. Every piece of evidence that can ever be found, whether it is someone who is claiming support for Israel, claiming to be against Israel, is used to prove the existence of the lobby in an unfalsifiable loop. Someone says that supporting Israel is in the U.S. interest. That's proof that the lobby forced them to say it. Someone said that supporting Israel is against U.S. interest. That's proof that the real interest is not to support Israel. And this isn't just quotes. In every historical example where the U.S. followed Israeli interest, that proves the lobby made them do it. In every example where the U.S. didn't follow Israeli interest, that proves that the U.S. has a different interest. Now, interests I'll discuss later. But the simple fact there are examples, many, many examples of the US not following Israel's interest proves that support is not unconditional. They might argue here that unconditional is actually that the level of support towards Israel stays the same regardless of what Israel does. But this is also a complete logical fallacy because let's consider the counterfactual. What would an actual unconditional support of Israel look like? It would obviously mean that US foreign policy aligns with Israeli foreign policy, that the default position is to defer to Israel's. But anyone with a small understanding of history knows that this is not the case. Walt and Mearsheimer, however, will view that every time there is an agreement over what position to take, and Israel wouldn't immediately comply to whatever the US wanted, and after that, the US didn't completely cut off all connections to the state of Israel, that each time that happened, this entails that the support is unconditional. Instead of realizing that the very fact that there are differences between Israel and the US on issues means there isn't unconditional support. And so to define unconditional as the US not cutting off ties every time Israel did not obey the whim of every changing US administration is frankly amazing. It seems from this that their understanding of what an alliance should be can only be complete obedience to the United States. That's barely even a vassalage. And we can see that actual US support of Israel has never been unconditional. It is always laden with conditions. And so you will always see these arguments brought up where Israel didn't do what the US wanted here or there. And that shows how the US interest isn't the same as Israel's interest. But that's not how alliances work. And that standard wouldn't hold for any other alliance as well. Now, regarding the lobby, they tried to say that it forces unconditional support for Israel, that it creates this chilling factor where no politician in the right mind can speak out against Israel. And this is true, except for all the times where it isn't. But then they will treat those times when politicians speak out against Israel as proof that in the other times the lobby is forcing the others. It's this circular logic all over again. And even so, we're talking about elections, we're talking about democracy. And yes, can a politician lose an election because of its stance on Israel? Yes. Instead of looking at that as proof of the strength of the lobby, it can easily be seen as proof of the strength of support for Israel among Americans, which at the time that they were writing was still very high. And now, sadly, as that has dropped, we can see how wrong this idea is. Because as support for Israel has dropped, you see more and more politicians speaking out against Israel. It kind of makes it feel that the correlation is towards support for Israel and not some sort of externality of a lobby forcing people to do what it wants against the will of the people. Because if that was the case, then it would still be able to keep those politicians in line even when support has dropped. Of course, circular logic is amazing in that they even use this to show how the Israel lobby was so powerful. But finally, people are overthrowing its chain. Now, look, I'll get to this later. But yes, is money involved? Sure. Also, they will bring quotes by like AIPAC lobbyists saying how much influence that the AIPAC has, which, what do you expect a lobbyist whose job it is to have influence to say? Oh no, me, I'm really, really bad at my job. I can't get a single bill passed. And this brings us back to a central question. Compared to whom? You look at quotes from other lobbyists. What would they say? Would that be any different? Are you questioning every lobby's success and saying that each time they are successful, it is untoward. What about other allies? You're saying it's unconditional, and that's weird, but compared to whom? Are you collecting quotes of every US official complaining about every other ally when they're not doing exactly as they're told? Have NATO members always followed their marching orders perfectly? And if not, why wasn't their support cut? Why weren't they thrown out of the alliance? But wait, you say, in NATO and other alliances, there's a binding mutual defense treaty. It's a very different thing. And this brings me to the next pillar, that the alliance with Israel is unprecedented. In reality, unprecedented is simply another way of saying unique with negative connotations. But every alliance the US has is unique. Some fall into broad categories like NATO, but even their interactions vary wildly, as they do with allies in the Asia Pacific. Unprecedented only matters if the alliance is some sort of order of magnitude different than all the others. And that brings me back to the point. There is no mutual defense treaty with Israel. This one counterfactual can do so much heavy lifting to understand the relationship between America and Israel, and even the need for the lobby. It cannot be overstated. So I will say it again. There is no mutual defense treaty between the US and Israel. Tell me, how much is a mutual defense treaty with the main global superpower, whose military budget dwarfs every other country, worth? How much is that military umbrella worth to everyone who falls under it? Can you put a price tag on that? I don't think you can. Now, another question. How much is it worth to have a large US military base on your territory with so much US military equipment, personnel, and logistics to defend your territory for you? And when your adversaries know that if they attacked you, they're probably going to kill some American soldiers, and that would mean that the US would automatically get involved, especially with that mutual defense treaty. These things you cannot put a price tag. But even if we must, we can put a price tag on, let's say, the logistical support for some of these bases. Just the logistical support for countries such as Germany, Japan, and South Korea is around 3 to 5 billion USD a year. And that is 3 to 5 billion only in the support for the base. And that is actually a small percentage of the total value of having that mutual defense treaty with the United States. And now compare that to Israel. Israel receives military aid. And believe me, that military aid comes with a lot of strings attached, partly from having to buy that military equipment from the US, which not only provides additional leverage on Israel, see Biden, but also limits the actual cost to the US of that military support because it feeds directly back into the system. And Israel then pays for all the logistical support, for all the personnel, for all their soldiers in the country, and they pay that out of its own budget. And that military support is only around 15% of Israel's military budget. Now, 15% is a lot. It's substantial. It helps. 15% ain't nothing, but it's not unprecedented. Is it structured differently? Is it coming in direct aid? Is it Congress approved? Is it not in bases and not in logistical support and not in a mutual defense treaty, but something else? Yes. And there are advantages and disadvantages to that. But to say how it is somehow unprecedented, or even more so, they try to create this idea that Israel uniquely creates the possibility of dragging America into foreign conflict. Now, a mutual defense treaty, like those of the US with other allies, is actually what makes that possible and unconditional by law. Not having one means that all the continued support that Israel received is entirely conditional on US interests at the time. And If Israel were to be attacked, which happened a few times over the last few years, the US can always decide when it intervenes and how, completely, conditionally, and totally not unprecedented. The US commitments to Israel are actually not unprecedented. And take some time to let that sink in, because I know for some of you, that's a shocker. The magnitude of support that Israel receives isn't that different than other major allies. It is simply structured different. And that structure also does some heavy lifting in explaining the unprecedented nature of the Israel lobby. If you have a mutual defense treaty with the US, then the need for constant lobbying kind of drops. What would lobbying for supporting a NATO ally even look like? Please keep them in NATO? Unless that's something actually up for debate, which, besides recent murmurings, it's not really. Why would one invest the time and effort in trying to have the US to support an ally which they are legally mandated to support? And interestingly, events from Ukraine shows if you have an ally where there isn't a mutual defense treaty and where there is also debate over whether to support them or not, then a lobby, a strong lobby, appears. And Ukraine receives support, and there is lobbying for Ukraine. Is it different than the Israel lobby? Of course it's different. But these claims of unprecedented are simply wrong. Alliance structures reflect the different nature of the different alliances, different allies. And here's a counterfactual. If the lobby was all powerful, wouldn't they push for a mutual defense treaty? Well, some might say, it is Israel who doesn't want one. Now, this, generally speaking, is true. I personally don't think we should have a US. Why? Because all support from the US is not unconditional, and it comes with strings attached. The price is that we don't have the luxury of having these American bases which serve as a tripwire that America would automatically intervene if we are attacked. The price is that, except for the subsidy, which even that we are saying, if this is going to be a problem for you, you can just not give it to us, because truthfully, this hasn't been about the money. Israel generally thinks that that price is worth it because a mutual defense treaty does have those strings. This also serves to disprove the Israel lobby, because if the Israel lobby was so strong that we are sure that the US would only do what's in Israel's interest, then it really doesn't matter how many strings are attached, because the US will be a good little boy and do as it's told. But obviously, that's preposterous. Simply, we are two allies, and the more connection there is, the more strings attached. And so, for now, the preferred structure is what it is. Now, in the book, it is purposely called the Israel Lobby and not AIPAC. This is done purposely to create this large, ambiguous collection that you can't really pin down. Now, this really isn't necessarily a fallacy per se, but it's a tactic which lends itself to making unfalsifiable and unverifiable claims. Because if they were simply to say AIPAC, then you can look up AIPAC and see how much funds they actually have. And go do that. Go open another browser and look at AIPAC, how many funds it has, and compare it to other lobbies. I'll wait. Oh, you're back? Okay, did you see? Yeah. Did you think that it is so far down the list? Now, of course, because the accusation is so unclear of what they mean by Israel lobby, they can say, no, well, it's not AIPAC per se, but it's the super PAC they'll have. But, how many super PACs are there? Oh, no, wait, it's not because it's AIPAC, but AIPAC is a domestic lobbying, and Israel's a foreign country. So look at foreign countries. Well, foreign countries are putting in more, but it's different because then it has to be registered different. Like, okay, look, if you put 18 different qualifiers on every single category, you can find that as a single issue, domestically supported and foreign policy, when you include super PACs, then AIPAC is near or at the top. Does that make it unprecedented? It would only be unprecedented if it was an order of magnitude more. And it really isn't. Both in terms of internal US lobbying, it's way down the list. And in terms of foreign lobbying, it's not even close. Only when you're comparing apples to oranges does it become something that's even near the top. Instead of saying how unprecedented that is in a bad way, could it also simply say, wow, no other foreign state has that much support amongst Americans? Do you actually prefer a foreign state which interferes in American politics without domestic support? Is that what you're saying? So, is US support for Israel unprecedented? No. Is it unique? Yes, as all alliances are. Is the Israel Lobby, AIPAC, and everything else that you might want to include in it unprecedented? No. Is it unique? Yes, just like basically every other collection of lobbies would be considered unique. There are so many domestic lobbies which are more powerful than the Israel lobby. There are a ton of foreign lobbies with more money involved. Only if you're comparing apples to oranges can you find a narrow window where the Israel lobby is leading its class. But even then, it's only leading its class, and it's not even unprecedented. It's not so different that it makes it an anomaly. And we also have to understand American lobbies. There is an idea that if support for Israel was natural or in America's interest, then there would be no need for a lobby. That is so silly. Do you know what's a lobby that's bigger than AIPAC? The AARP. Is supporting senior citizens such an unnatural, controversial topic in America? There are child safety lobbies. Who's against child safety? In America, there are lobbies for everything. I think the only unnatural lobby in American politics is a lobby that doesn't exist. But it's the size of the Israel lobby, which is the problem. And as I've shown, it isn't. But let's pretend for a moment that it is. There's an explanation for that. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Israel is controversial. I know. I've just admitted this huge thing that we've tried to keep a secret. But from what I've seen around is that there are some people who don't like Israel. And this isn't even a new thing, but it has been around really since its foundation and kind of before it. And there are even some of those people in America that don't like Israel. Now, whenever you have a topic which is controversial, then that's going to raise the amount of effort that needs to be put in to maintain support. This is the political version of Newton's third law. You can argue what came first, the chicken or the egg. Be my guest, but as long as there are two forces within American policy trying to push that policy in one direction or another, you can't place a requirement on one side to sit the discussion out because it might look bad. Now that we've established that support and an alliance with Israel is neither unconditional nor unprecedented, now let's see whether it is against the US interest. And here I'm only going to be giving a cursory explanation because interests are much more complicated than Walt and Mearsheimer actually want you to believe. So I can't give a full explanation of interests involved, but I don't need to. Here we're only going to be looking at how they try to prove this case in the book, how they try to claim that supporting Israel is not only against US interest, but so far against US interest as to be unconceivable that someone would think that it might be. And first of all, we have to return to our old friend, circular unfalsifiable logic. Any time that interests diverge, they claim it proves that America doesn't share Israel's interests. As I said in my first video, two parties, two groups of people will always have different interests. That's the nature of having groups of people. And them bringing in a quote by Kissinger saying that they have different interests, or bringing in a quote on the Israeli side of Dayan saying that Israel's interest isn't always the same as America, it's not proving anything. It's a non sequitur. There will always be interests that align and interests that don't align. And they are using the selective reading of history, looking only at the times where those interests didn't align. This is also a logical fallacy, selection bias. And they do this on two levels. The first level is, again, compared to whom? Are you going to go through every single US official, what they have ever said about every other US ally when their interests didn't align with America? And are you going to go through every single politician from every single allied state when they said that their interests don't align with America? Because if you are, well, I can tell you where to start. Basically, the entire reason behind the European Union was so Europe can pursue interests independent to that of the US. There are so many quotes about it. Have you ever heard of Charles de Gaulle, a leader whose country literally owed its liberation to American soldiers? Yet he is someone who spent basically his entire presidency defying American foreign policy? Have you ever seen what he says about the differing interests between France and the US? The question always has to be asked, what are you comparing Israel to? Some sort of platonic ideal of what Walt and Mearsheimer think an ally should be, which is barely even a vassal? Or actual alliances, actual allies in the real world where interests always diverge? Because if that's the standard, that every time interests diverge, the US has to get rid of the ally, then it has to get rid of every single alliance it has. And if it did that, it would be much, much poorer for it. That's the first level. The second is the selective nature of the quotes themselves. It's almost like they're picking out every warm day that occurred during winter over the last 70 years and then using that to prove that winter isn't cold. Are there times where US and Israeli interests diverge? Obviously, there are many times, but I also don't see them making a list of all the times their interests converge, or of all the times that Israel went against its own interests in favor of the American interest. And even when they find real material interests that converged, such as the intelligence that Israel provided during the Cold War, they will do everything to try to disregard it. That they even brushed aside, saying, well, we never actually went to war, so that intelligence didn't actually even help in the end. So it didn't even matter anyway. Which, what a beautiful sidestepping of everything they ever stood for. As if actual hot war is the only test to whether material value is worth something. Mearsheimer's entire thing is about balance of power, for anyone who's familiar, right? And so if you're saying that a state that added to your balance of power wasn't worth it because that balance of power never got to a hot war, it's insane. It's actually insane that they try to make that argument. Now, they do make claims that it is Israel's existence that makes all of these Middle Eastern states hate America, which is interesting because I've also heard that America is still able to make different deals with Middle Eastern states. I'm not sure if you've heard this as well, but it seems to be the case. So it might not be such a zero-sum game after all, but this leads to another circular logic loop, which is as follows. They try to say that Israel isn't under existential threat, because then it might be like morally imperative to like help them. But then later on, they bring all of these quotes, which kind of suggest that the problem that Israel creates for America is the fact that it exists and the US supports it. But they also then say that Israel can defend itself by itself, so it doesn't need US support. And if they say that, then it kind of refutes the thesis that Israel can't provide anything strategically. Because on the face of it, if it was such a powerful state that it's able to defend itself from all comers in the Middle East, then it seems that choosing it as an ally in the Middle East would be a pretty good idea from a neorealist perspective. So that's his own enclosed logical fallacy. But again, let's return to that one counterfactual. There is no mutual defense treaty between the US and America. This means that in the Middle East, America gains an ally that pays for its own military, that buys American equipment, yes, also with some funding, and does this without a mutual defense treaty, not making America have to defend it, not being under the America's military umbrella. And they gain all of that, but their problem is with that $4 billion a year as some sort of unprecedented burden. And even that helps fund American military industry, lessening the burden itself. That's the big thing against the interest. That seems kind of like a steal to me. But now there would be some people in the back who are saying, ha, the military industrial complex, which, say what you want about it, right? Believe in it or not. But the point is that if you're going to use that, then it kind of disproves the existence of the lobby. So it's kind of either or. We can see that suggesting that the US and Israeli interest align is not some sort of crazy thing. That all of their proofs that the support for Israel is not in the US interest don't hold up. You don't have to accept right now that it is in America's pure interest to support Israel. But it's hard not to accept that there are Americans who will view it as such. There are Americans who view it as being in America's interest to support Israel. And when you have Americans who view supporting Israel as being in America's interest, who consider having a strong Israel to be in America's interest, and maybe, even just maybe, they will add moral and normative reasons to that consideration as well, then the lobby is simply a foreign policy interest group voicing what they believe is in America's interest, supported by Americans who feel that way. Walt and Mearsheimer set out to show that this cannot possibly be the case, but any critical reading of their work shows the exact opposite. Now, before concluding, I do want to point out one more fallacy that they make. One that really shows their bias. Because they do actually, in fact, go into moral interest, if only to try and prove how it also can't possibly be a justification. But how they address that is actually fascinating. Their case is quite simple. Their logic is that they see Israel as an immoral actor. And they bring in the usual to support that stance. Wars, the Palestinians, and so on. And they say that because Israel is immoral, there can be no moral reason to support Israel. Now, this is a fascinating logical fallacy. For a second, put aside the questions of if the accusations they bring against Israel are true or not. The fallacy is in equating your understanding of what is moral or not to an objective moral truth that is so true that no other claim can even exist. Morality is never that simple. Nothing is ever that simple. And frankly, it's a measure of the profound hubris they have to assume that your morality is so universal that not only is it correct, but that it precludes any other understanding. You can disagree on morality. You can't think that by presenting your side as the more moral side, that you are magically poofing your opponent out of existence a la Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy style. To illustrate how absurd it is, it's as if they're in a campaign for an election, and they're not saying their party is the better choice. They're not only saying that because it's the better choice, they should just call off the election, but that their party is the better choice, so there cannot actually be any other party, because there cannot be the option for someone to believe in something else. And this type of reasoning is still being propagated, especially over the last few years, where people feel that their moral case against Israel is stronger. And it's a preposterous argument. Now, if you want my own views on the accusations against Israel, I have an entire playlist devoted to that. Okay? So you can go to that here. But just recognize how insane that argument is. Now, before we conclude, we need to recap a couple of things that you have to accept in order to accept that the Israel lobby is bending America to its will. You have to accept that nations are black boxes and that democratic values and norms and anything else has zero impact on how they choose an ally. You have to accept that Israel has no value as an ally. It is powerful enough to defend itself alone. You have to accept that it is unconditional, even though there's so much evidence to the contrary. You have to accept that it's unprecedented, even though there's so much evidence to the contrary. You have to accept that it's not in America's interest, even though there is so much evidence to the contrary. And you have to think that an alliance means being a vassal that does whatever it's told. You have to not compare the alliance with Israel to any other alliance, or the lobby for Israel to any other lobby. All of that you have to accept. And an amusing paradox is that even if you were to accept all of that and live in that fantasy land where all of that is true, that would entail that little tiny Israel is capable of forcing the biggest superpower in the world to do all of its bidding. If that were the case, then it would actually counterintuitively make Israel extremely powerful. And in their narrow neorealism framework, that alone would make it an alliance worth pursuing, or at least someone worth listening to. Funnily enough, the problem with Walt and Mearsheimer isn't that they're biased. I'm biased. The problem is that they either truly believe or pretend to believe that their bias is simply the only legitimate truth. And so anyone who doesn't agree with them must be, by definition, perverting the truth and distorting reality. Let's be blunt. It has become patently clear that they don't actually believe in a foreign policy without norms. They simply try to frame their preferred norms as objective truth. If your theory simply labels contrary opinions as invalid, and that means that anything that goes against you is irrational or hijacked, then you are not doing objective analysis. You are simply fighting a political battle, and you're just pretending that you are the arbitrary of what is legitimate and what is illegitimate. Now, is there a collection of groups in America, which could be called an Israel lobby, which use political and financial support in order to sway and persuade public opinion and politicians toward Israel's side? Yes, that is a feature of American politics. And if you're going to get rid of money, if you're going to get rid of lobbying, do it for everyone. Don't simply disqualify the one lobby which happens to be tied to the Jewish state. Rather than saying that it is unprecedented, say that it is unique. Look at why it is successful, why it has found fertile ground. And don't just say that all lobbying means that it is unnatural. Look to the arguments being presented. Lobbying is like advertising. Advertising is important. Advertising is useful. But if you're advertising a bad product, it's not going to work for very long. If you try to convince something, the best way to do it is to have a good argument. And for many, many decades, everyone agreed that supporting Israel is the best argument. Now, have things changed as of late? Sadly, true. Is that because there is less of an interest to supporting Israel? I don't think so. But it is true that we have been making our argument less clear, less forceful, and less profound. And that is what needs to return. Not to say that there shouldn't be a lobby, but to understand that a lobby is another form of argumentation and that the arguments need to be better and clearer, which is one of the missions of this channel, to produce and show in a logical fashion the clarity and the purpose and the interests and the morality of the state of Israel, both in service of an alliance with America and an alliance with every other state that may want one, and with all the public around the world who really needs to hear these arguments. Interests of allies are never perfectly aligned, but the more they are aligned, the stronger the bond can become. What's interesting about their analysis is that even though they seem to be advocating that the U.S. should seek out alliances in the Middle East to the detriment of its alliance with Israel, they never stop to ask if the U.S. interest is that aligned with those countries. They don't go in and try to find quotes talking about if they have diverging interests with those countries as they do with Israel. It's a constant application of double standards, of one standard for Israel and another standard for every other country. Are there differences? Yes, but there will always be differences. The simple truth is that an alliance with Israel is strategically defensible, especially when compared to the high cost of other U.S. allies, not even taking into account how supporting a fellow democracy is a highly popular and normative choice. The Israel lobby is not a suspicious externality perverting American interest. It is simply a standard, highly successful, and no one should be ashamed of that, democratic advocacy group operating exactly how Washington is designed to work. Recently, there has emerged another argument, which has also been informed by the Israel lobby, and it presents itself as the moderate position, that what the U.S. needs to do is simply treat Israel as a normal ally. But what would that entail if the U.S. would treat it like a regular, normal major ally? A mutual defense treaty, for one. Every normal major ally has one. That's what the U.S. provides to its allies. And if that were the case, then there might be some minuses, but then Israel can drop its spending down to, let's say, 5% of GDP, which is expected from its allies. And any reduction in direct support would immediately be offset. It would also make that alliance actually unconditional, as every other normal alliance with the US is. And it would make it not constantly under attack by opponents, both foreign and domestic. I'm not sure that that is what the people advocating for a normal alliance means, but that is what a normal alliance looks like. Now, these are seasoned academics, and they knew their work was controversial. In their introduction, they even hang a lantern on the problematic criticisms they expected to receive, putting a spotlight on these criticisms and saying, no, we're not that. It serves to kind of preemptively clear themselves from any and all accusation, because they are essentially saying, even though it might look like this, it isn't. They say they're not questioning the legitimacy of democratic discourse or even of lobbying. They are merely criticizing the Israel lobby. And they also claim that in actuality, what they want is in Israel's best interest. But it's the lobby who is so destructive towards Israel. So by attacking the lobby, they're actually helping Israel. Isn't that nice? And this is meant to belly any accusation of, dare I say, or they explicitly say, anti Semitism. They even explicitly mention the protocols of the elders of Zion because they knew their work would be compared to it. And they protest that really is nothing like that. They even say that Israel has a right to exist and that defending it might actually even be okay if it was in this existential threat, which, by the way, they don't think it ever is. And all of this is used as the sort of get out of jail free card for any criticism that might come down the line. To be sure, I'm not making any claims against them, but we do have to understand the dynamics of that introduction and how those same dynamics are repurposed in the modern discourse, where as long as someone would say, well, look, you can't sling that accusation against me, then that serves to wipe their hands of any misconduct. But understand that logic doesn't work that way. Your argument needs to be based on its merits, and your bias, which becomes apparent in your arguments, has to be looked at objectively. And simply by proclaiming that you are not biased, that you are not acting specifically against one group's interest, and that you're not singling them out on purpose, it's not your fault if they're the ones doing it, that doesn't actually put you in the clear if the rest of your entire work you actively kind of do just that. It's kind of like the academic equivalent of saying that you can't be racist because you have a black friend. Now, there is a real claim where, because the accusation of anti Semitism has been bandied about so freely recently, then you can just say, oh, well, you're just calling me an anti Semite because everything is being labeled anti Semitism, and I can criticize Israel and not be an anti Semite. Well, this is true, but there can also actually be something which is anti Semitism. And yes, this is a problem that the pro Israel camp placed on themselves by using that term way too broadly and by making accusations in a way which is seriously not called for and counterproductive. But simply because the word anti Semitism has been grossly misused, it doesn't mean that it doesn't actually exist still. Now, I'm not saying that Walt and Mearsheimer are anti Semitic, but we have to realize that this same defensive tactic is used by groups that would more clearly and definitely fit that definition. And it is really an own goal that people have provided them a really robust defense by claiming that everyone is an anti-Semite. Because if everyone's an anti-Semite, then no one's an anti-Semite, and the term loses its meaning. But that defense basically means that you cannot claim they have bias, because if you claim they have bias, then that is perceived as claiming that they are anti-Semitic, and therefore it has to be objective. But that really is not the case. And so we can try to look and find their bias without necessarily saying they're anti-Semitic, but simply to recognize that just by them hanging a lantern on a topic doesn't mean that they're in the clear from all accusations of bias. And this opens the question, how did two illustrious academics produce a work riddled with so many basic fallacies? It's hard to understand. To illustrate this, let's change the earlier equation I used to illustrate the externality And let's look at it this way. Here we have Walt and Mearsheimer, two rational, seasoned academics with all the facts before them. The evidence, as I showed, clearly points to the fact that Israel is a competent ally, which does have its own needs and interests, but allying with it isn't some crazy idea, and that it is a perfectly legitimate stance to take when you look at the interests of the United States. And the other option is that there is this cabal that effectively controls American foreign policy and push it to support Israel, even though it is a complete illegitimate option. And let's say option A, being the correct answer, is plus 1,000, and option B being minus 1,000. And they chose option B. As they would see it, this requires an externality that has influenced them against their own reason towards that direction. I don't claim to know what that is. I leave it to the viewer to decide. I never like making arguments that could be considered ad hominem, but when looking at the book The Israel Lobby, and when looking at the vast amount of circular logic and discrepancies they make in pursuit of trying to force a complex world into a narrow theoretical point of view, that even from that narrow theoretical point of view isn't even a contradiction, and they only do it through circular logic and by ignoring so much of the evidence that could be brought for the other side, it's hard not to come to some disparaging conclusions about the authors. They spent their careers discounting norms and thinking that everything has to fit into their stripped down version of neorealism that cannot handle any of the nuance that exists in the human condition. But they themselves are human. They themselves see the world through an ideological and normative lens. And it seems there's a possibility that it is through that lens, that bias, that they wrote the Israel Lobby. In the end, there are two main options. Either in spite or because of their illustrious careers, they try to force their theoretical and normative standpoint onto something they couldn't make fit, and this caused them to commit these major academic errors, which I am not sure they would be accepting from an undergrad, or they wrote it knowingly, and they knew of the problem, and they were fine with it in order to produce the result that it had. And that result has been thoroughly destructive to the nature of the American-Israeli alliance, especially the discourse. The publishing of that book cannot simply be viewed in a vacuum, as if it was just another set of scientific findings by well-reasoned, well-respected academics. Their misconduct in writing the book, the circular logic to really the open bias when it comes to morality, cannot simply be brushed aside as honest mistakes. Their comments in the years since show, really without a doubt, that they very much have a dog in this fight, and that they will use their stature in order to convince the public that Israel is beyond the pale. They, in other words, are part of a lobby. All their circular logic can be applied equally as well to them. They are not neutral academics. This they have shown, and that's fine. But if you are a combatant in the information space, at least have the decency to do so openly and understand that as a combatant, you are not immune from criticism. You are not a neutral observer. You are not simply an academic with all of that prestige and courtesy afforded to you. Of course, being academics is their biggest tool because once an academic finding enters the discourse, it is naturally stripped away from all the circular logic that is found in the text. And it only becomes the simple conclusion that these esteemed professors understood that Israel and its lobby is forcing America to do its bidding. Now, I really don't care how much they hung a lantern in the beginning, because academia is viewed as if it's objective. The effect, if not the purpose, of publishing the Israel Lobby is indistinguishable from age-old anti-Semitic tropes. And whether they did it on purpose or not, they have succeeded in laundering age-old conspiracy theories that are indeed reminiscent of the Elders of Zion, which they explicitly said they are nothing of the sort. They have laundered it into academic discourse, and they have dressed it up with the airs of respectability and objectivity. That has happened is undeniable to anyone familiar with modern internet discourse. And if you're unfamiliar, like I said, the comment section on my previous video is there for all. The damage they have done is too large to extend to them the courtesy of pretending that they are neutral academics. Bias isn't a dirty word. Fake objectivity is, or at least should be. If you want to hear more, go back to the beginning of the video, switch over to the Klingon audio track. There I put out long, informal bonus content where I go over my thoughts about the video, different challenges I had in making it, in producing the script, how I came to my conclusions, how I looked at it, as well as a book recommendation and more in a sort of podcast format. And also, you can follow me on X, you can support me on Patreon, you can like and subscribe, you can ring the bell, you can share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Until next time, this has been Causality. The news reports the symptoms, we provide the diagnosis. Take care.